baby boomers,
I used to be with it.
millennials,
Okay, boomer.
Generation X,
What's going on?
and Gen Z. What do they have in common? Not a lot, it turns out. But one thing they can agree on is that this is the political podcast they want to listen to. Welcome to Not My Generation, the political podcast that looks at political events, news, and happenings across the world and at home through a generational lens. Your hosts are Dr. Emily Stacy and Professor James Davenport, two political scientists from Rose State College. But the views expressed on this program are solely the views of the host and their guests and do not reflect the views of Rose State College, its administration, faculty, or students. Coming up on today's program.
Speaking of festering,
it is America's truest and purest experiment in genuine totalitarianism.
If you don't feel bad or outraged or otherwise somewhat discombobulated after studying history, you're not doing it right.
A great democracy recognizes the sins and crimes it's committed in the past as a way to make itself better.
I feel like I've just been upbraided by my father. And now, here are James and Emily. Welcome, Emily. How are you today?
oh my goodness, James. Hi, I am wonderful. You are so enthusiastic. I am always aghast to
We
hear
just
this.
had a State of the Union speech, and we have some fantastic guests with us today, right? So
It's true.
it's all good.
It is true.
We have with us today Jonathan Rauch from the Brookings Institute. Is it institute or institution?
It's institution, as in, I'm not getting married. Marriage is a great institution, but I'm not ready for an institution. The famous words of Mae West.
And we also have with us Dr. Aaron Bachhofer, program coordinator for the history program at Rose State College. And we're going to be spending a good portion of our time discussing Jonathan's recent article in The Atlantic. Emily brought this to our attention. You want to say a couple words about that? And then we're just going to jump in and start talking.
I read it and was moved, and we knew Jonathan and had that connection from him being so lovely and coming to Rose State on our Constitution Week a few years ago. And so I thought perhaps this would be a really good time, given the climate around LGBTQIA plus issues, for us to have a conversation, which is likely why Jonathan wrote the piece in the first place, which we'll find out soon about. So I appreciate Jonathan having the time to give to us today.
Yes, absolutely. Before we get into that, we've got some icebreaker questions that we ask every guest. And so we're going to start with that. And so I'll just jump in with the first one. Jonathan, we're going to ask both Jonathan and Aaron these, right? All right. So are you Gen X, millennial, or other? We'll let you go first, Jonathan.
I'm other. I'll let you guess what generation that puts me in. But I will say it is one that I am ashamed to be a member of.
Oh, my. Oh, my.
Well,
Yeah,
I
I'm a
am
baby
clearly
boomer.
in the Gen X group. I am very much a child of the broken promises of the Reagan years and AIDS and the Breakfast Club and punk music and new wave music from New York. So, yes, very much.
That fits your aesthetic, sir.
As I always say, in the 80s is when music got good.
Exactly.
And it never has been as good since.
Downhill from there, my friend.
Dear listeners, I am so glad that James Davenport's office moved away from mine, because this man would be blasting hair metal right next to me. So we're very glad he became associate dean and got a bigger office down the hallway. Next question. Aaron, we'll start with you. What are you currently reading, watching, or listening to?
I am reading a book together with all of us in our book club, Stephen Levitsky's book on How Democracies Die, which is fascinating. And the next book I'm going to read will be, it's Timothy Egan's book on the Klan. And it's so I'm very excited about being able to start that.
Awesome.
Jonathan, how about you?
I'm reading Jacob Heilbrand's brand new book called America Last, about how for pretty much the better part of 100 years, the American right has played footsie with and often admired and emulated right-wing and fascistic foreign regimes and dictators, and still is doing that today.
We've had some discussions about that recently, haven't we? Yes. All right. Jonathan, sticking with you, what is your favorite social media platform?
None.
That is a surprise. That is a common answer. That's correct.
Regardless of generation.
That's right. That's right.
Well, all truth, I do have a Facebook account and an X account, but I rarely check them, and I'm not a fan of either, honestly.
I like using Facebook. I like it. I have Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it. But I can put as much as I want on Facebook, right?
You also like shaking your fist at the sky. So
sometimes,
Facebook fits you.
Sometimes, yeah.
It works. Aaron, what is your favorite pastime or hobby?
Well, genealogy, and because it hits on all of my hot spots, history, family, and so forth. But I also have taken a liking recently to sitting on my back porch when the weather permits, drinking scotch and solving the world's problems.
We like that. Jonathan, what about you?
I'm a music lover, classical music lover, and attend a lot of concerts and listen to as much music as I can make time for. Going to a concert tonight, National Symphony Orchestra.
Awesome.
Wow.
All right, last one. Jonathan, what is one political view you hold that puts you at odds with either a peer group, colleagues, or your family?
All of them.
I love that. That's fantastic.
That's not
I would say that I'm not a big fan of cancel culture, and I find it problematic that we're dredging up from time to time things that a person said or did 20, 30, 40 years ago, and suddenly, despite years and years of good service to the country or whatever it might be, that they're now persona non grata. I find that a little troubling. I know I've grown a great deal in the last 30 years, so I would hope that we would allow that, for other people as well.
All right. Let's get in. We're going to talk about this article. Emily, I'm going to let you lead off because this was your project as far as bringing this to us. So run with it.
Sure. So, Jonathan, can you please explain your most recent article that we've been discussing in The Atlantic? And again, tell us why it was important for you to write about in the current climate.
So I am a homosexual American born in 1960. Till I was 13 years old. I and people like me were declared officially mentally ill by the psychiatric establishment. We were not allowed to work for the United States government. We could not have security clearances. We could not serve in the military. Homosexuality was criminalized in most states. In 1960, when I was born, it was criminalized in every state. And what was criminalized was not just homosexuality per se, as in so-called sodomy laws, but even gathering socially. Bars were raided. People were arrested under statutes that were for things like public nuisance and obscenity and loitering. One was not safe even in one's own home. Homosexuals were driven from society by every level of government, federal, state, local, by culture, by the medical profession, by the Christian religion and other religious elements. There was an all of society war on homosexual Americans that really ramps up in the mid-40s, does not really end at the governmental level until 2011. It's a campaign to erase the very concept of homosexuality from American life and American minds. It is America's truest and purest experiment in genuine totalitarianism. I can defend that statement. And today, it's being forgotten. The names have not been surfaced. The stories have not been told. We don't even know the numbers of the people who suffered, even though many of those people are alive and well and walking among us today. I profiled one in my article, and that's unacceptable. An offense, a crime of this scale by every level of government needs to be accounted for and apologized for. And that's what I argue for in my article, which is called America Should Apologize to Gay People.
As I was reading your article, it just struck me the totality, as you mentioned, of this attempt to basically stamp out, if you will, any vestiges of homosexuality whatsoever. It wasn't just something going on in law enforcement in the courts. It wasn't just something happening in psychology, but it was, as you mentioned, every facet of life. There was this effort to push it out, to cover it up, to bury it, to eradicate it.
Eradicate, obliterate, annihilate.
You mentioned this has been our purest, most horrible attempt at totalitarianism. Can you go into that a little bit more?
Yeah, there's a distinction here. So I am not claiming that what was done to gay and lesbian people and what today we call transgender people and bisexual people and so forth, those terms didn't exist at the time. So I stick with the older language for these purposes. I'm not claiming that what was done to gay and lesbian people was the worst thing America's ever done, that it was as deadly, for example, and physically abusive as was done to blacks who were enslaved or lynched under Jim Crow, or the what was done to the Native American tribes that were forcibly resettled and often killed. I'm making a different point. So totalitarianism, if you know your political theory, I think you do, is the notion that it's not just government being oppressive or discriminatory. It's government trying to seize control of people's minds and using every channel of society, not just the government, but every channel of society is bent toward a political and oppressive end. And that's what was done to gay people. It wasn't just some discrimination in some jobs. It wasn't just the federal government, or it wasn't just some local police forces, or it wasn't just science and medicine, or just religion, or just popular culture. It was all of the above, all focused on the object of obliterating homosexuality and homosexual identity, driving it deep into the closet, persuading people that it effectively did not exist. And it would come and find gay people wherever you were. You were not safe at home. People were arrested at home. There was no place you could go to socialize. Bars were raided. Liquor licenses were denied. You were arrested on the street. Of course, there was a campaign of terrorism, street terrorism. We called it gay bashing, but it was not safe really anywhere in the country except a few small neighborhoods to hold hands if you were a gay couple. And of course, legal equality like marriage was laughable. So that's why I call this genuinely totalitarianism. It's totalistic in its means, and it seizes control of the mind as an end.
Right, invoking public morality in order to basically enforce a way of life or a policy agenda or something. Right, you infect the minds of the citizens, and they do your job, do the job for you.
Yeah, it's Orwell's 1984, right? It's about how many fingers am I holding up? I say 3, you see 2. Well, 3 is the right answer from now on. That's what they were doing.
It reminds me of what I think of as a police state where the citizens were encouraged and in some cases incentivized to turn in people suspected of this, right? And
yes, that's an important aspect. It's Stasi-like. This is again unique to the campaign of gay and lesbian Americans. Investigators would hunt us down, and once they found someone on suspicion of homosexuality, they would bring them in for hours and hours of interrogation and promise them that they might get off without an arrest if they would give the names of others. It was like the communist witch hunts, but many, many more people were involved because, of course, there were many more gay people than there were communists. And so they would create these networks of informants, and that would make it really impossible to know who in your life you could trust, who might turn you in, where would be safe? Just socializing at a bar could mean the end of your career the next day.
Aaron, one of the phenomena or events that Jonathan mentions in his article is the lavender scare. Can you give us a little bit of background and historical context on that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. The lavender scare is a colloquial term for essentially the Red Scare as it applied to queer Americans. And I've got to go back in time just a little bit to understand how this comes about, and really why in some cases the Red Scare became the lavender scare. As a matter of fact, the goal of certain demagogues in this period really became to target queer people because it was easier on a number of levels. So this is a three-pronged issue, I think. First, you see in the latter part of the 19th and early 20th centuries in Europe primarily, the nomenclature is finally established regarding a person's sexual identity. What is a homosexual? What is a heterosexual? And that was a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, it gave people for the first time the words to describe themselves and a sense of belonging to something other than just their singularity somewhere. But it also made them easier to identify, made them easier to, again, as Jonathan has discussed, to find, to ferret out of their occupations and their homes and places of socialization. So that was one issue. There is a greater presence of queer people in larger metropolitan areas like New York City and Chicago, even in Oklahoma City. That was one prong. Another prong, I think, is clearly the United States sense of mission and nationalism. Again, this is a late 19th, early 20th century phenomenon. Just as we became players in the international market during the Spanish-American War and World War I, and certainly World War II, we also began to flex our muscle abroad in terms of defining what the world would look like when these conflicts were over. And of course, at home, that translates into things like anti-immigrant hysteria, anti-Catholicism, and of course, as Jonathan suggested, queer bashing and other anti-LGBTQ plus laws and things. And so that's another prong that's associated with this. And I think the third thing, and it's the final message or the final part of the recipe, I guess, would be the Cold War. After World War II, the United States felt very empowered not only to make peace for the world, but to define what the world would look like. And we wanted them to look like us pretty clearly. And so we started to export this sense of Americanism, which meant 100% married, heteronormativity, traditional gender roles. Our racial attitudes were not exactly evolved at that point either. But this opens the door for demagoguery and stupidity on the part of people like Joseph McCarthy, Roy Cohn, J. Edgar Hoover, and others who at the national level started going after prominent people who were suspected of being communists. But because that turns out to be kind of difficult at times to pin on them, they started looking for maybe lower hanging fruit. And there were a number of people in the State Department who had supposedly been let go for being openly gay, or maybe had been accused of being a homosexual by one of their colleagues, whatever. And so suddenly that seems to be a more profitable series of work for these people to do. Because if you think about it, if you're a queer man or a queer woman in this era and you have a high profile security clearance and a good job in the State Department, you want to protect that, and you're going to go to great lengths to do so. And if you are found out and you are removed, there's absolutely no recourse open to you at all. And as Jonathan suggested, the numbers are really unclear as to how many people were removed. Once Eisenhower issues Executive Order 10450, the numbers have ranged anywhere from 3,000 to as many as 10,000 people, but we don't actually know how many people were interrogated out or pressured out who were never officially released because of their sexual identity, but did so because they thought it was the path of least resistance at that point. And this is very pernicious because over time, the way the federal government reacts indicates how state governments should act. Yeah. And then state governments send out very strong messages to people who live in their communities, And so it is definitely very much a trickle-down approach, and it was much, much more difficult to be queer by the 1950s than it had been before.
I was going to say, the numbers you're talking about, those are the federal numbers, right?
Certainly.
So we don't know if we even try to look at what happened at the state and local level. That's even harder to get a handle on.
Certainly. And everyone has their story. In Oklahoma City in the 1960s, it's Curtis Harris, the district attorney for Oklahoma County, who made it his mission to get LGBTQ plus teachers fired, who went after prominent homosexuals in the arts and entertainment industry in Oklahoma City. It was very pernicious. It was very calculated, and it had a chilling impact on everything related to civil rights in the city.
Are you or your organization looking for unvarnished, unbiased scholarly political analysis for your op-eds, candidates debates, or interviews regarding all things political?
Well, look no further. We are the Democracy Slingers. We're here to host, comment, educate, or just preach the good word of American politics to your school, club, company, or organization. Get in touch with us at democracyslingers@gmail.com.
So what are the parallels then between the politics that led to and allowed the Lavender Scare to occur and the modern wave of anti-LGBTQIA sentiment, legislation, and rhetoric? What are the dangers of the current situation in the United States? Jonathan?
Well, yeah, we do have to talk about the present. Before I come to that, could I just amplify something that Aaron just said?
Please.
So I've been talking about the crimes of the past and the 60 to 70-year war on homosexuality. But we also need to talk about what I think is the kind of crime in the present, which is the crime of forgetting and covering up. It is stunning. There has never been a National Truth Commission or Reconciliation Commission or any kind of effort to uncover what was actually done and the magnitudes. We know with pretty good precision how many African Americans were lynched, and there's a memorial to them, and they're named. We have no friggin' idea how many homosexuals were fired by the government. The military records are poor. We have even less idea what happened at the state and local level. All we can say, as Aaron said, is that in the Lavender Scare, probably 5,000 to 10,000 people at the state and local level, hundreds of thousands. But we don't even know. And this is not taught. This is not known in the schools. Most young people, if they know anything about LGBT history, know that there was a riot called Stonewall. And after that, everything was okay. History is not remotely like that. So the country has committed this huge crime and has had no reckoning for it and never recognized the victims or named them or numbered them. It's all being washed away. And the people who are still alive who know these stories are dying. So that's really got to change. To me, that present crime is a doubling of the past crime. So the campaign to erase homosexuality from American life, now called LGBT and expanded to include these other groups, but I mean the whole thing, sexual nonconformity, gender nonconformity, it's going on. It's, of course, much less powerful than it was. I would never compare it today to the time I was growing up. I'm married now to a man, and that's not even controversial. That's a miracle to me. So I am not suggesting that things haven't changed. But there are groups now with names like Moms for Liberty that are going around the country campaigning for the removal of all references to sexual orientation as well as gender identity from textbooks, from classrooms, from school libraries, and from public libraries. And this has gone so far that one public library, actually removed from the shelves a book whose author's last name was Gay. Now, that book was restored to its place on the shelf ultimately, but think about the level of paranoia that librarians are feeling when they're going down the shelves, obliterating anything with the word gay in it. Governor DeSantis in Florida has passed the Stop Woke Act, which, as now interpreted by the state government, says that you cannot instruct in the public schools through grade 12 anything involving sexual orientation. This is of a piece with the 70-year war effort to erase homosexuality and homosexuals from American life. So this is not over. It's a cliche, but still deeply true, what Santayana said. Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeating it, and we're repeating it.
Yeah. We've seen some of that right here in Oklahoma. We actually have a school district that is pushing back a little bit. We had the state Department of Education here threaten their accreditation over a couple of books that were in the Edmond Public Schools library. They filed suit against the State Department of Education. And they've had 2 or 3 other school districts
more than that
that have issued support for them, and the State Department of Education said that they're going to withhold taking any action until that suit is resolved. But we're seeing that here in Oklahoma as well as around the country. Nowhere is safe, I think is the best way of saying that. No place is immune to some of the ugliness that we've seen elsewhere.
Sure. Aaron, what parallels do you see?
Well, I certainly echo a lot of what's been said so far. The level of demagoguery, I think, is alive and well, at least as it relates to LGBTQ plus issues. But at least here in Oklahoma, we also see it in relation to the Tulsa race massacre. I mean, people are still, we're 100 plus years behind that event, and folks are still absolutely determined to try and see that we either don't talk about it or that we talk about it in ways that don't make people feel bad, which, I've cautioned folks, if you don't feel bad or outraged or otherwise somewhat discombobulated after studying history, you're not doing it right. And that's in regard to the LGBTQ plus issues. You certainly see attempts to, for instance, the trans issues, anything regarding restrooms or public presentation of gender. We're still fighting these battles. We're still having these sorts of conversations. And unfortunately, we live, I think, in an era politically where the kind of rhetoric that is used by important people, politicians, high profile people, has an impact at the state and local level. And it seems to empower and otherwise give those folks a feeling that they can say and act and do things that are highly, highly uncivilized, unkind, and just generally not conducive to being a good human being.
Yeah, James, that's a perfect parallel to the next question.
Yes, no. So in Oklahoma, we recently had a non-binary student in Owasso School District, Next Benedict, who passed away following an altercation in a restroom with other students. Following that incident at a public gathering, a state senator from here in Oklahoma was asked about that. And I'm not going to give the full quote, but in large senses, he said that, referring to Oklahoma, we are a religious state, and we are going to fight to keep that filth out of the state of Oklahoma because we are a Christian state, we are a moral state. And although his comments were condemned by Republican leadership in the Senate, not a lot of other places were they condemned, right? By the leadership in Oklahoma. Just so everybody knows, if you're not familiar, we are a deeply red state. The entire apparatus of state government is controlled by the Republican Party, and really, I can think of one Republican. That's the Senate President pro tempore, Greg Treat, who came out and said, these do not reflect us. They do not reflect the Senate or me or the leadership. And it was pretty quiet after that. I mean, I didn't see any other Republicans following his lead in doing that. What does it mean when someone with that kind of influence and who's in an elected position feels free to make these comments. What does that say about the environment that we're in and the environment that those in the LGBTQ plus community find themselves in today? Jonathan, you want to lead off with responding to that?
Well, I may be a little unusual in LGBT world because I don't actually care all that much if some ignoramus calls us filth. There are always going to be people like that out there. I'm much more concerned that public policy reflect equality. For example, that marriage rights be preserved. So I don't get my underwear all in a knot when it surfaces in the headlines that some, forgive the expression, I was going to use a bad word, but I'll just say some person says something ignorant. And I don't even necessarily get all super upset if not everyone in that person's party or race or institution immediately rushes to denounce it. Sometimes it is better to ignore ignoramuses and haters and let them marginalize themselves. What I do get my underwear in a knot about is a political environment where a former president and soon to be nominee of his party is referring to fellow Americans as vermin. Now, that's a kind of political rhetoric coming from the very top, which is associated with all kinds of mass crimes against minorities and other people, as he well knows, and also which is creating a permission structure all the way down the line for the worst kinds of behaviors from people in that party, not just targeted to LGBT people, but we've heard all kinds of things recently. There's is it a Senate candidate? The guy Trump endorsed who has said those crazy anti-Semitic things. So that's what I'm worried about. That gets us into broader politics, which is, I guess, not our subject today.
Well, I agree with Jonathan in theory. You're always going to have people, stupid people who say stupid things. I mean, that's just the nature of the beast, I think. Unfortunately, in this era, when the Trevor Project puts out a number of different statistics and studies that discuss things like how well-adjusted and happy and confident LGBTQ plus people feel, particularly students K through 12. And the results usually show that the levels are not super high. And so when you hear an elected official, albeit an elected official from southeastern Oklahoma, small area, it is hurtful. And we all three of us here at this table encourage young people all the time. You've got to be the change. You've got to be the vote. You've got to stay involved and engaged. Well, when that kind of rhetoric is used, to me, it has a chilling effect on their ability to feel good about participating in the political system. I mean, we talk about, James, you just mentioned that the head of the party basically said that's not how we roll, but did anyone else? Right. I mean, right. Did any of his colleagues publicly excoriate him a little bit? I mean, for goodness sakes, McCarthy at one point is censured, and we don't see that kind of political intestinal fortitude anymore. I mean, a young person died, and regardless of how you feel about their sexual identity or their gender identity, I think that kind of comment coming very closely on the heels of, I feel bad for them, but that coordinating conjunction eliminates everything thereafter. It's problematic for me, and it does. We've talked about how this cascades down from the top, and it gives people fuel, and the reticence to not do or say hateful things, I think, erodes over time when they hear that kind of rhetoric over and over and over again.
This is Oklahoma. You only get censured for bipartisan immigration policy.
Apparently. I wanted to follow up, Jonathan, with something you said in your response to that, which is, do you see a real effort to roll back some of the protections, some of the equality efforts that have been made for gay and lesbian citizens over the last couple of decades? Do you see an effort to really push back against those, or is this really coming from a small but very vocal segment of society. Tell me what, if you're being very, very pessimistic, what do you see going on? And if you're being very optimistic, what do you see going on?
Well, I don't know about pessimistic or optimistic. I'll just say what I see, which is a backlash, an understandable backlash, because the last 10 to 20 years have been years of extraordinary progress toward gender and sexual equality. We've seen the military ban on gay and lesbian service members dropped. We saw it dropped against trans people, who were then reinstated under Trump. But I think President Biden now has gone back to the previous policy. We have seen same-sex marriage come into force and now achieve 70% popularity among Americans, including, I believe it's now past 50% among Republicans. And we have seen the Supreme Court, written by a conservative justice, declare workplace anti-discrimination for trans people. This is a new age. I think it's inevitable that when you see that much social change, and I call it progress, that quickly, you're going to see some people fighting that and pushing back against it. I don't see anything that looks to me on a policy level like a successful backlash. I think what's happening here is kind of the vestiges of a way of looking at things. So I'm not walking around in fear that my marriage is going to be overturned anytime soon. But yes, I do worry at the state level, especially, about some of the measures that we're seeing come into place that we've discussed earlier, like the Stop Woke Act and like the many, many, many bills in state legislatures around the country that are trying to erase LGBT teachers and students and instruction. So that's happening. But it's happening in the context, I think, of overall progress. And it goes to a point that we touched on earlier, which is, I am not asking that Americans go around with hair shirts saying what a terrible country we live in because of what we did to LGBT people. I'm saying that a great democracy recognizes the sins and crimes it's committed in the past as a way to make itself better because of who we are. And I'm saying that we made ourselves stronger and better when, for example, Congress voted an apology and restitution to the Japanese American internees of World War II, which they did under President Reagan. I'm saying they made America stronger and better when the country apologized for lynching, not because it tells us what a terrible country it is and we should all hate it and we should all say that things are backsliding, but because that's our way of commemorating the moral learning that has been the hallmark of this country.
Do you think that there is some connection? There's got to be, I suspect, but that acknowledging that in some way, it's like Aaron said, well, that makes me feel bad. And so I
think it should make us feel good.
I don't want to acknowledge it.
There's this provision that we've seen in a bunch of state legislatures, and I think it passed in one or two states. You tell me if Oklahoma has it. But it's this notion that students shouldn't be taught anything about race, gender, sexuality that makes them feel uncomfortable. Do you have that in Oklahoma?
Yes.
Yeah. Yep.
We have that.
Is that a law in the books or just a...
Nope, it is. It was 2 years ago.
Yeah.
2 years ago that the legislature passed that. There was a lot of, and there still is a lot of reverberations, both in K through 12 and even in higher ed. Although we've probably seen a little bit less of that, but I think it's only a matter of time before the legislature has us in their crosshairs.
But you say
well.
That's passed into law. That was signed into law.
That is correct. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
so this is being picked up from, ironically, the campus left, which has been saying for a number of years now that if students are made to feel uncomfortable or unsafe, that's a form of verbal violence. And they've used that as a way to clamp down on speech which is deemed racist sexist or homophobic or classist or offensive. And the right has picked up on that and said, "Two can play that game. It's a bad game to play." And one of the reasons it's a bad game to play is that, sure, there are aspects of our history which will be uncomfortable to read about, but we need to know them, obviously, because we're a liberal democracy. We need to understand and correct our mistakes. And that's the American promise to the world is that we have done that again and again. We have found ways to improve ourselves and to better deliver on the promise of the Declaration of Independence. And we will continue to do that, but only if we are candid with ourselves about our flaws, even if it makes us uncomfortable.
There's not to get too religious, but there's this notion in Christianity, confess your sins and you'll be forgiven, right? You acknowledge the errors of your way, and then you can move forward. And when you don't do that and you try to bury them or ignore them, they have a way of festering and causing problems.
Speaking of festering, we're in the middle of not really even anymore the primary season. It's become pretty evident by the last week, obviously with Super Tuesday occurring, that we are going to get Biden-Trump round 2. So for both of you, and we'll start with Aaron, even though a majority of Americans would prefer anything but these two, here we are with these two. So what's your overall view of the presidential election this year? Is there an opportunity for a third party or independent ticket? I will note that last night, Joe Manchin and Mitt Romney sat together at the State of the Union, and it made me a little excited, just a little bit, I'm just saying. So is there an opportunity for that? And what would have to happen for that to take place?
Well, I think overall, I would have to say that I'm a little disappointed with the slate of candidates. And it's not necessarily, I freely admit that I will never support Donald Trump. I haven't, and I won't for so many reasons. But I think that Joe Biden, for me at least, represents a very old school Democrat who still believes in this kind of the sanctity of good graces and people having decency and coming together and figuring problems out, which I think honestly is a little old fashioned, at least the way politics in Washington currently stands. I thought the State of the Union last night was a better Joe Biden, and that he was coming out talking about some of the positives from his first term, and that's great. But I don't know how that's going to portray or how that's going to fall with the under 30 crowd. I don't know if that's really going to be enough. As far as the possibility for, we all know the barriers that keep third party or third challenges from being successful. It's obviously money, and the way the system is, there's always an incumbent, which is an issue most of the time. And historically, when we've had third-party challenges, they have ended up being co-opted. Think of the populists in the 1890s. They're co-opted into the Democratic Party. You think of the 1912 race between Roosevelt and Taft and Wilson. Roosevelt takes votes from both of them and probably allows Wilson to sneak in there. And then, of course, in 92, we have the Perot factor.
He was
which
so adorable.
I know, adorable with those ears and all. But so I do think there's a chance, given how razor thin some of these margins are, if you had some kind of a third party, a third way, whatever we're going to call it, representing maybe a Manchin and a Romney, something like that. I don't even know what that would look like, or either or, that there could be enough votes taken from one side or the other to flip the election. But we're going to get one or the other, I think, pretty clearly. I'm
still putting out in the ether Haley Cheney, or Cheney Haley, either way.
Before we go down that rabbit hole, because you and I have done that, and I think we enjoy doing so too much. Let's let Jonathan weigh in on here. What give us your perspective of the overall environment and what we can expect, and your concerns going into this November election.
Well, that could take a couple of days. Is there any particular aspect that you would want to focus on?
Okay, let's stick with this notion. Is there any opportunity at all that an independent or third party ticket could make some progress?
Don't even think about it. So I'm the least partisan person you've ever met, probably. I've voted for many Republicans and many Democrats, and my politics are center-right on the whole. But I believe that the reinstatement of Donald Trump would almost certainly be the end of liberal democracy as we know it. And I can back that up. By within a year of being elected, he will be openly defying court orders. And his party and his members of Congress will support him in doing that. And by the end of 2 or 3 years, this will be normalized behavior for court orders to be optional and a president to simply refuse to do them. And that's not liberal democracy anymore. So I think there's really only one thing that matters if you care about liberal democracy, and that's keeping this person out of office. There is only one option for doing that, and that is the Democratic candidate. Although there's a whole lot I admire about Joe Biden and his policies as a person, he is clearly a flawed candidate. Someone like me has to say, well, we set all of those flaws aside. We have only one mission in this election, and that is to save our democracy. And a third party or independent candidacy would very likely help Trump because Republican voters are more consolidated, unified, and enthusiastic than Democratic voters, which means it's more likely that a third party candidate takes voters in key swing districts away from the Democratic Party. There's no possibility, excuse me, there is zero possibility that an independent or third party candidacy could actually win the presidency. So all we're talking about is spoilers.
All right, I'm gonna. You kind of bursted Emily and I's bubble. I'm just gonna say we've been. I still want to believe there is a narrow pathway for an independent run.
How does that work?
If you had the right.
How many states do you think that person could possibly win?
I think that's the key, and I don't think they would have to win that many.
Then you throw it to the House. Guess who controls the House?
If they throw it now, if they throw it to the House, then you've got a question of who controls the House, and it's not just a matter. It's not in that situation. It's not just a matter of which party has more seats in the House.
Exactly.
It's which party has more delegations.
Correct. And you know who
in
that
the
is,
House, right? That's going to be the Republicans, probably,
there is
right?
No pathway. There is zero pathway. Get it out of your minds. Stop talking about it. Put your shoulders to the wheel and get Joseph Biden across the finish line. Those are your marching orders. Got it?
I feel like I've just been upbraided by my father.
You have been taken to the woodshed. The time for daydreaming is over.
Thank you, Jonathan. I appreciate that.
I know that sounds partisan to some of your listeners, and I know they don't believe me when I say I'm not a Democrat.
Well,
I'm an independent, but it seems to me the stakes this time around are different than they've ever been before.
Yep.
I'm a former Republican. All of my conservative Republican friends think I have gone over to the dark side and I'm some raving liberal now. Which is interesting because all my colleagues think I'm some radical, libertarian who's all, so I'm
yes.
kind of
and if Nikki Haley were the nominee, I would say, great. That is great. Now we have someone who is young and vigorous and espouses conservative ideas in a principled way, who is not going to destroy our democracy. I would breathe a huge sigh of relief, and I might well vote for Nikki Haley. But Donald Trump is a different kind of animal.
Now, this is a question I really want to get, and I know we're knocking on the door of time here, but what happens to the Republican Party after Trump? I don't think it goes back to being the Republican Party of old, but I don't know what does it do Trump-like figures begin to dominate it? I think part of Nikki Haley's problem is she's trying to run for the nomination of the old Republican Party. And that party doesn't exist anymore. This is Trump Party at this point in time. My question is, does it remain Trump Party afterwards?
I'm turning that over to Aaron.
Oh, thank you so much.
Anytime, Aaron, be my guest.
I wonder whether the infusion of younger people generally, and by younger at this point, it's anyone under 50. If you inject the party with a younger base, with a younger generation of leadership, come on, the goal of electioneering is to win. And if you want to offer the kind of slate and ticket that will win, you're going to have to at some point deal with younger voters. And so I'm wondering whether in the post-Trump era, there will be some kind of revitalization. It will not be the Republican Party of old, but it may be a Republican Party that is more akin to younger issues, maybe the so-called moral issues, social issues, abortion and LGBTQ issues and whatnot fade from the landscape, and instead we start to deal more coherently with the budget deficit and our relationships with foreign powers and so forth. I don't know if that's true. I have to tell myself, though, that the younger generation will save us, or at least a younger generation. So I think there's possibility for a realignment. I don't know whether it will occur because, again, the people in Congress seem to serve until literally their last picture in office is of their arms folded as they're taken out in a box. So I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good answer.
Thank you.
He does a good job.
Yeah. One way to think about this question, of course, no one knows what either party looks like in 10 years. But one way to think about it is that for the last 50 years now, this has been going on since the George Wallace movement of the late 60s and especially the early 70s. The American party system has been resorting along educational lines. And that means that increasingly, the great divide in American political life is between those who are college educated, which is about a third of the country, and those who are not, who are working class, especially people who are white in rural areas. So you've got one coalition that's college educated, a lot of people of color, though those are beginning, working class people of color are beginning to drift into the Republican direction. And a lot of people who are whiter, more rural, but especially working class. Those latter people are feeling left behind, and that's in no small measure because many of them in their communities are being left behind. They don't perceive that the Democratic Party has done as much for them as it should have. Actually, it's done a lot. Joe Biden has done a whole lot for that group, but he's not getting recognized for it. And that group has turned out to be very susceptible to an angry, nihilistic mindset. An authoritarian mindset. And that's been what Donald Trump has been able to rally. Donald Trump, however, is not new. We saw this movement in George Wallace, who used some similar rhetoric, and Pat Buchanan. So the question becomes, the Republican coalition is still contested, right? I mean, Nikki Haley won almost 40% in a couple of those states and 30% in a lot of the others. And that tells you that there are still a lot of Republicans, not a majority, but there are a lot of Republicans who are not on board with the Trump style, the MAGA style of politics. There's not enough of them to win the nomination against Trump this year, but there's enough to have a real contest over the future of the party. The open question is that political movements, you need a horse to win a horse race. And Trump is just a brilliant mobilizer and energizer of his base. Without a figure like Donald Trump, does the base produce another figure like that so that the MAGA movement remains viable? Or does it kind of melt away? And it won't completely melt away, that's for sure. I don't think the Republicans will ever change back into the country club party that they once were. But the big variable is, I think, what happens at the leadership level and how the base responds to it. And the truth is, I just have no idea, but I hope what I just said at least helps us to think structurally about the question.
Sure. Well, Jonathan, thank you for joining us today. And Aaron, if you haven't read it yet, Emily and I both encourage you. I think I can say that on
Absolutely.
Check out Jonathan's article in The Atlantic titled "The U.S. Should Apologize to Gay People." Exceptional piece of work, and gives a lot of us who are not as familiar with the history of the LGBTQ people in the United States and what they went through is a brief but very good kind of introduction to that history that I think we all could learn from. So thank you both for being here with us today.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
And I think we'll wrap it up where we want to remind everybody,
Democracy is not a spectator sport.
We'll see you next time.
We love communication that goes both ways, not just you listening to us pontificate. We would love to hear from our audience. If you have comments, suggestions, or would like to contact us about possibly being a guest on the show, please email notmygeneration@raider.rose.edu.